Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. I am Srivatsa Subarna, your host for the day. The banking sector has seen some interesting developments in the last few weeks. Lakshmi Vilas Bank, a leading bank in South India, collapsed, and the Indian subsidiary of the Development Bank of Singapore is going to take over the bank. In addition, the RBI working group has come up with a set of recommendations on licensing new banks. These cover a set of recommendations around letting NBFCs who have been in operation for more than 10 years or having an AUM of over 50,000 crores become banks. In addition, RBI is looking to welcome new banks in the form of corporate entities who meet certain criteria. So, to cover all of this and more, and the impact of this on the Indian economy and the banking sector, I have two special guests today with me. So, to start off, I have Nirav Kanodra. Hi, Nirav, how are you?
I
So Nirav has been on an earlier episode of Bharat Varta. He's an investment banker based out of Singapore with extensive experience in the sales and trading function. He's also considered a prominent voice when it comes to macroeconomic issues on social media. In addition, he's a budding cartoonist. Uh, Next, we have Karan Bhasin, who you would have heard multiple times on the Bharat Varta podcast. Hi, Karan. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Karan is a researcher with interest in macroeconomics, Indian economics, and public policy, uh, and again is a very prolific columnist and writes across multiple publications such as the Mint, the Swarajya, on various issues related to economics. Uh, so to start off, I'll start with you, Nirav. The RBI working group has proposed a few recommendations in terms of new banking licenses. Could you summarize these for us?
okay. So basically, what RBI has done is they've suggested that NBFCs, which have been operating for at least about 10 years and have like total asset base of 50,000 crores, that they could get a banking license. And this it also opens up, given that there are many NBFCs who are existing owned, or the main promoter is a corporate house. This would open a backdoor for corporates to get into the banking business, which typically in a lot of countries, due to the nature of retail bank deposits being federally insured by the government, it is discouraged in a lot of countries, though it does exist in some countries like Japan and Korea. So this is not yet being passed. It is just a working paper. It's a guideline. It opens it up for discussion, and given the way Indian financial landscape is, where some of the NBFCs have a substantial size and a big chunk in credit creation, and they too need to be regulated, like we had the ILNFS issue. So I think RBI is looking to get these within their ambit of regulations. So that's the main reason behind their thinking.
Okay. Karan, coming over to you. So, what happens from here? Are these recommendations binding? And secondly, what time frame, processes, next steps are we looking at? Till these recommendations are actually implemented.
To give you an idea of time frame, let us just say that the DTC committee report has been submitted to the government several times over the last decade, and we are yet to see it become a reality. People think that okay, this is a government committee report. It has submitted its recommendations, but these are not binding in nature. Government can choose whichever parts it wants to implement. RBI can choose whichever part of it wants to go forward with, and it can stagger the recommendations over a period of time. As Nirav rightly mentioned, that the purpose of this is to initiate a discussion And I think that as far as that purpose is concerned, they've been successful because there has been a renewed interest on the kind of financial system that we want to have. What sort of consolidation do we want in the sector? Do we want NBFCs to be, eventually converted into banks and give them access to depositors' money, or access to the discount window that RBI offers? So these are some of the important issues that have emerged over the last couple of years, last couple of quarters. And unfortunately, because there was this vacuum, we had no clear idea of sorts of how do we deal with these kind of situations as and when they come. And on that front, I think the recommendations do a good job, because it does propose how to proceed forward, and what kind of financial system do we want to have. I think probably what the way forward would now be that RBI would take a look at some of these recommendations and try to see whichever is feasible and adopt them over a period of time. And there would be a discussion internally and even externally on some of these provisions, which is happening even as we speak, because we are discussing the proposals, even though this is outside. And at the appropriate time, the appropriate policymakers will take a call.
Sure. Nirav, coming back to you, I had another question on another event that has happened in the last month with the Lakshmi Vilas Bank. Now RBI has decided that the Indian subsidiary of DBS, which is a Singapore-based bank, will get ownership of the bank. Now this is seen as a step where RBI is okay with giving over, say, a failed bank to a fully owned subsidiary versus, say, a branch of a foreign bank. And RBI has been looking to encourage foreign banks to open fully owned subsidiaries in India. What do you think the implications of this are from a supervisory mechanism standpoint?
Yeah. So if you go to the difference between like branch and a subsidiary, so like the basic difference is that a branch of a foreign bank has been fully is guaranteed by the parent company, but it is not capitalized in the local jurisdiction. Whereas like a subsidiary, it has a segregated capital base, which is a separate entity altogether. And so one of the issues what happened in 2008, so post Lehman, there was a lot of worry that some of these other large foreign banks, and Citibank, Standard Chartered, HSBC were the big ones, but the American one was Citibank. There was a worry that to fill up their losses in their home country, they would withdraw all the money in this within India. And if it's a branch, it can be unwound easily. It is not separately capitalized with a separate board, with a separate, basically equity capital base. And hence all the money can be pulled out very easily. If it is a subsidiary, it shows commitment that you are there within this jurisdiction, as well as I can say the closest parallel, if you want to go back in the 70s, where like George Fernandez had asked for companies to list locally. So this is somewhat of a similar thing, where you want the banks to establish a little bit deeper roots within India, and hence by going through like a subsidiary route, it is ring-fenced the assets within India, which are immune to any issues that the parent location might have. So that is, you would say, the broad difference between a branch and a subsidiary. And exactly as you pointed out, so DBS had already set up a subsidiary in India because their CEO, Piyush Gupta, has had a lot of ambitions to expand in emerging economies. So India, China, Indonesia are some of them, and within India, they've set up a full subsidiary. And now they got an opportunity where like a cooperative bank like Lakshmi Vilas Bank had failed, and all their subordinated bonds, 81 bonds, are being written down to zero. Probably their equity stake gets written down to zero. And DBS comes in, injects some amount of capital within this, and merges the entity. And this gives DBS also 536 branches. So I think it's a win-win situation. And exactly because it is a subsidiary and it is establishing roots, RBI is more comfortable letting a foreign bank take it over versus a bank with just a branch. So yeah.
Got it. Karan, any thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I think the decision to allow DBS to take over, an existing Indian bank must be viewed in the context that RBI is a conservative central bank. It does not take these decisions unless, of course, there's been a rethink at the highest possible level. Now, some people might say that one of the reasons why we went to DBS was because we didn't have any other alternative left. If you look at what has happened or what has transpired over the last couple of months, we find that this was the third such bank. Of course, all three banks had their own set of challenges. They had weak balance sheets, and RBI was proactive enough to ensure that it could rescue the depositors. But after the Yes Bank resolution, I mean, many people say that probably there was no one left to take over Lakshmi Vilas Bank. And I think that's an unfair statement to make because, we had the likes of SBI, LIC, etc. Any one of them could have easily taken over should the government would have wanted it to happen. And the fact that government resisted that temptation, that in itself tells us a lot about its commitment to, or RBI's commitment, to ensure that there's greater competition within the financials and particularly the banking sector. If you look at the way RBI has responded over the last couple of months, we see that issues related to transmission, issues related to governance, these are some of the areas that they're particularly interested in ensuring that the system is reformed and becomes much more effective and efficient. And the surest possible way to achieve that is to have greater competition. And I think the decision to give it to a subsidiary was precisely because they wanted to allow another bank, even if it is a foreign-owned bank, but as long as it is a bank with commitment towards the regulatory system in India, to take over, scale, expand, and compete with the private sector and the bank, public banking sector that we have. So, to simply look at it, I think we need to put the context right that this is a very conservative central bank and it has done something which is extremely bold. And it gives us a sense of direction going forward with regards to RBI's supervisory, regulatory, and overall approach to the sector.
Great points, both Nirav and Karan. So Nirav, since 2000, the private bank share of deposits has gone up, to 30% and advances to 36%. So private banks are anyway growing. And I remember listening to Nandan Nilekani when he once said that public sector banks are losing, a percentage of market share a year. Considering all of this, since private sector banks are anyway growing, do we actually need these new regulations?
Okay, so I think if you look at it in a way, is if you look at the public sector banks, the way they've been set up, I think they've done a fantastic job of spreading banking branches and raising deposits. So on the liability side, and because there is an implicit trust amongst everyone that your money is safe in all of these public sector banks, that no matter what, your deposit is good. You will not face, despite all these other banks failing, depositors have always been safe. And so that is one part where the public sector banks have done a good job. Where the public sector banks have not done as well is, so you can see two parts. One is errors of omission. That is, till 90s, they did not give out home loans. They refrained from giving out consumer loans. And that is where HDFC Limited, which was an NBFC, housing finance company, took a lot of market share. So first, they did not lend to credit-worthy borrowers, which could have been a profitable opportunity. Hence, the banking sector made less money. And then two is the errors of commission, where either due to adverse selection, either due to not advanced enough credit analysis, or due to a more relationship banking approach, where big industrialists or people like Vijay Mallya could get their loans rolled over or evergreened. they've had a much bigger share of NPAs versus the private sector banks, right? So yes, you are seeing that public sector banks have lost market share, but still they're 70% of the deposit base or like 64% of the credit base, right? So they are still a fairly large sector. What you have also seen is the growth of NBFCs, and where like these banks were missing out on the pockets of, say, giving consumer loans or giving like retail, extremely retail loans to buy like a mixer grinder or consumer electronics or clothes with shopping mall kind of shopper stop co-branded cards, etc. And which is a lucrative enough business adjusting for any sort of credit losses. That is where all the NBFCs came in. Also, in a lot of infrastructure spending, where IL&FS, which is the largest NBFC, systemically important one, so they stepped in. And what actually happened was that banks who had a lot of retail deposits, they would lend to these NBFCs, and these NBFCs would further go on and lend to whoever they wanted. And if you see for a bank, the retail deposits is a very sticky sum of money. And whereas in an NBFC, they keep borrowing short every 3 month or like 1 year paper they keep issuing, and they lend out long term. So say you give out a home loan for 20 years, even if it is amortizing, average life is 10 years, and you always have the risk that you've given out loans for a longer tenor and you are unable to refinance in between. And that's precisely the issue what happened with IL&FS. It is a lot more unstable as a structure, whereas like a bank is extremely stable deposit base. So actually I'd like to tell you, like discuss that what is two main functions of a bank. So one is maturity transformation, and two is taking risky assets and giving out and creating safe deposits. So I'll give an example of a bank. Say the bank has a total balance sheet size of 100 rupees. In 100 rupees, if we see that it has to have roughly 5 rupees of equity capital, 80 rupees would be retail deposits, 10 rupees could be wholesale bonds, longer tenor bonds, etc., as well as money market transactions, repos against government bonds, and another 5 rupees could be subordinated debt, the AT1 bonds, etc. So that's 100 on the liability side. And on the asset side, in India, if you have whatever you have on of your total assets, 20 rupees you'll have to hold government securities, 4 rupees you'll have to deposit with RBI, and the remaining 76 rupees you could give out loan of 1 rupee each to say 76 different customers. On the deposit side, you have 80 people's 1 rupee deposit, which if in a checking account or in a short-term fixed deposit, the money can be taken out at any point of time, but typically average duration is very long, right? And on the asset side, it has given, say, 76 different people 1 rupee loan. Some could be like home loan, which will go on for 20 years. Some could be a car loan for 5 years, infrastructure loan for like 30 years, and like different types of consumer loans, right? So what it has done, step one, it has taken a lot of short-term assets, short-term liabilities, and converted to long-term assets. And number two, each loan that it has given out could be risky. But you know, on an average, as a portfolio, it is not. And the equity capital of say 5 rupees, 5% of the total assets, as well as the subordinated debt, another say 5%, is enough cushion that you will not see more than 10% of your assets defaulting at any point of time, unless there is some adverse selection. So it creates, from risky assets, it creates safe liabilities, right? And typically, because these deposits are insured, so people feel that their money is safe despite the bank undertaking a risky lending activity. Now, what an NBFC does is the NBFC is somewhat similar, but it does not have the high level of regulation that a bank has from RBI, because they're protecting retail deposits. So NBFC could be even more leveraged than a bank. But say they have like 5 rupees of their own equity capital, they borrow 95 rupees for a short term, 3 months, 1 year, maybe even up to say 5 years, and they give out very long term loans. And they do not have requirements that they need to hold like SLR, statutory liquidity ratio of government bonds, or a CRR, or they do not even have a liquidity coverage ratio that the next 30 days estimated withdrawal that they need to keep in safe liquid assets. So it has a much more lighter touch. In good times, it is a very lucrative business because a lot less regulation and you can lever up more. You borrow at 5%, lend at 10%. On a levered amount, you have like 5% margin, and it's all fantastic. It's all good till like the music stops and you cannot refinance yourself. And that is a big problem. So we saw that in IL&FS. Lehman Brothers, though it was not called an NBFC, it was like a broker dealer, more of a securities trading firm. But exactly same problem was there, that they finance long-term mortgage-backed securities with like short-term money market funding. And hence NBFCs are inherently unstable. So what has happened is that banking sector is not as big as it should be. And some of the NBFCs have become very big. So now that is also a worrying part. And given that some of these NBFCs, so if I just name out, so L&T Housing Finance, Bajaj Finance, one of the best performing stocks recently, you have Reliance Capital, you have Tata Capital, you have Muthoot Finance or Malappuram Gold Finance. So a lot of these, where the banks have not been able to penetrate, either by having like a branch network, either by having like focused lending, or some of these NBFCs have particular better skill sets, like HDFC Limited. It's a firm which knows how to give out home loans. It has a very, very low NPA ratio. So they do know how to select which borrowers are creditworthy. So that's a good part of the credit creation. And so basically what you have is PSU banks have missed out the profitable part of the business. They've made a little more losses in some places. And what that has done is that has eroded their equity base. So as I said, like a bank has levered up 20 times. So every rupee of profit that they make, they could give out 20 rupees of new loans, right? Yeah. And that's how like the private sector banking has grown. But at this moment, the entire banking sector, by not growing, say, fast enough, is acting like a brake on the economy of India's GDP. So if we can like lubricate it and somehow inject more capital, so either it could be giving incentive for overseas banks to set up subsidiaries, so that injects new equity capital, or we signal out that banks like HDFC or Kotak, they've issued preference shares, they issue shares which a lot of the foreign investors have picked up. So they're largely foreign owned. But so that is how they've grown their equity capital base. The thing is, we do not have the equity capital base to grow our banking sector. And hence RBI has come out with these kind of guidelines, which can allow some of these NBFCs to become banks. So helps RBI to regulate them better. And hopefully we increase our credit growth.
Yeah, that's a pretty comprehensive answer. Karan, coming to you, on the one hand, we talk about consolidating banks and creating larger banks. And we also talk about increasing financialization through, new competitions, fintechs, and so on. Do you see some sort of a contradiction here in these goals?
No, so I'll actually answer that question, but before that, I'll take on from where
sure.
Nirav just left on the asset liability mismatch. I think what he's saying is particularly very important for people to understand. And one of the points that he made was that while banks have been efficient at raising deposits, NBFCs have been efficient at lending and credit growth. Yeah. And some of the NBFCs have indeed become bigger than banks. And what that says is that we have a financial system, or rather a banking system, where we have specialized institutions that function better at one of the particular sort of objective, or at one side. So NBFCs are better at asset creations, and banks are better at liability creation, and you cannot have that. And he mentioned that IL&FS was a refinancing problem because banks were not able to lend. In fact, a lot of NBFCs are able to raise finance only through banks. And I think that's one of the reasons why RBI is looking to allow NBFCs to gradually move towards the banking sector, so that they can also be efficient in the sense that they can raise deposits and manage their risk better. And I see no reason why we shouldn't be doing that in any case, because at the end of the day, we need to look at the banking system, and we need to formulate policies that ensure that the system as a whole becomes more efficient and more resilient, and has the ability to absorb risks and shocks as and when they come. Now that brings me to the question that you asked with regards to wanting to expand the banking sector, getting in more capital, and at the same time promoting fintech and so on and so forth. In fact, interestingly, this entire debate about allowing corporate sector to come into banks is very intricately linked to what we are discussing, in the sense that today also there was an op-ed by three people whom I respect a lot, in the Indian Express, where they're saying that we cannot have corporate houses run banks, and they list their own reasons, and so on and so forth. Now, my prime objection to these ideas is that A, you do want banking sector to grow, and B, you don't know what the future of banking is going to look like, which means that there's this disruption that is going to come in from fintech, from peer-to-peer lending, and so on and so forth. And our banks are not equipped enough to handle that kind of disruption unless they're given the kind of scale to be able to, have the advantage that scale brings with it. And this debate about scale was something that probably we settled in 2008 when we decided to allow banks in the US to become bigger. And the understanding was that if banks are bigger, they're better able to manage risks, and they're unlikely to fail, and depositors will have a lot more confidence in them. Fundamentally, I think the way we are looking at the banking system today, we do have to allow NBFCs to become bank and banks to become bigger. So NBFCs can actually even take over some of the banks, some of the weaker banks, so to say, in the public sector, which I think should be taken over by private sector, so that we can turn them around, and that will allow them to become bigger and give access to safe deposits and to long-term deposits to NBFCs. And at the same time, fintech and P2P lending and all of those operations which are primarily originating from technological advances, and these are coming from firms that are more in tune to fintech and sort of high level programming, AI, blockchain, etc. Now those are disruptions that eventually have to be managed by the banking sector. Banking sector cannot give it a miss. It will have to adopt to some of these new technologies that are emerging, and I think that is where we will see further consolidation and further sort of acquisitions take place. In my view, I think the distinction of a payments bank, the distinction of an NBFC banks, I think in 2020 it has started to make little sense, because the fundamental function that each of these are performing is essentially a separate part of the banking function. So the question really is that should we have different institutions specializing in different banking functions, or should we have a universal bank that can specialize in lending activities in certain sectors, but at the same time provide its customers with different services? And I think the latter is a much better alternative and a much better system, which I think we should strive for and go forward, with the idea that we want to create that sort of system. And I think there are lessons over here as well that we need to learn, because I'm someone who has consistently maintained that there are positives and disadvantages to both. And of course, there are advantages of having scale, having big banks and better risk diversification and so on and so forth. But the flip side is that when we remove the regulatory compartments in the US, those enabled banks to over leverage and the Lehman crisis to happen. So the real question is that what are the regulations and what are these compartments that we can get away with without creating the problem of a systemic risk? And what is the regulatory role that we need to put in place? Should we have RBI separate its monetary policy functions and its regulatory functions? And what is the appropriate role of tech going forward in bank regulations? So these are some of the larger issues that I think have opened up ever since the discussion paper came to light. And I hope that this answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I also believe that, the APIification of banking is inevitable, in the sense that the core services provided by a bank will be continued to be provided by a bank. And then some of these fintechs which specialize in certain services, they can literally sort of ride on the bank infrastructure through APIs, and then, help the bank provide these services to its
Yeah.
customer. Makes sense. Thanks for that, detailed perspective, Karan. Uh, Now moving on. So this question is to both of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Nirav. What do you think are some of the issues and challenges with, corporate entities running banks?
Sure. So one of which is being set out the most is that now that if a corporate entity, if it has an access to a bank, it can ask the bank to lend more to the parent company. So for example, if say L&T has a bank, or say a Tata or a Reliance has a bank, they will say that all the money has to be used for its own purpose, and so it'll get bulk of the loans at say an off-market rate. So they can borrow probably at a preferential rate from their own bank. And in case of the companies under stress, a lot of these loans could get evergreened, and then finally they would default. And as I said earlier, that typically in a bank, equity capital is just 5% of the total assets that it has. And so what might happen is you might put a lot of depositors' money at risk in giving out bad loans to a said corporate. But it is not as easy to give out 100% of your loans to like one corporate entity. Obviously, there are guidelines, and so the easiest ones are like the SLR CRR ratio, where you need to keep some money in safe securities or as a deposit to the RBI. But also you have like issues about a single exposure to either one sector. A while ago, the RBI had said that real estate lending and house prices were rising a lot. This is about like 10 years ago. They had increased the risk weight on home loans, and they had increased the risk weight on lending against property for like developers.
Yeah.
That's another area where all NBFCs took over. And so, yes, there are prudent norms. Whereas if you go to see like an NBFC has a very light touch regulation. So now the same NBFC can lend to bonds without as much supervision, right? So if you were to say, but yes, that NBFC has to keep borrowing from short-term debt market by issuing commercial paper, and which is finally bought by banks. So that is one major issue. But like on the flip side, and that what happens is, because the corporates are going to run their banks as a private enterprise and they have their name attached to it, they have reputational risk. A lot of these corporates have been running for 50 or over 100 years, say like the Tata Group or the Birla Group, etc. And they are already quite active in the financial sector in either NBFCs or like insurance companies like Birla Sun Life Insurance, Tata AIG Insurance, mutual funds. So in this part, they could have some domain expertise, as well as they could have some equity capital, which can make the whole banking sector a lot more robust. So they could expand the size. So it is a trade-off. As I said, developed economies in the West typically have a segregation that no corporate house can own a bank. So banks have to be independent. But in Japan and Korea, what has happened is you've had very mega banks and like mega corporates with a lot of cross holdings. What also it does is that these big corporates have a much cheaper source of funding, and it actually is a hindrance for a lot of the SMEs. And say if you have, so in Korea they're called chaebols, in Japan they're called kairetsus. So these can dominate the industrial and the financial sector, and they can squeeze out some of their competitors who are smaller. So this is one drawback. You also have an example of Indonesia in the East Asian crisis. So before that, they had a lot of corporate houses owning banks, and they had a big bad loan problem. And since then, based on IMF recommendations, they've stopped that. So there is a positive as well as a negative. It also depends on like the kind of regulation. And the last point I want to mention is we had PMC Bank failing recently, which despite, though it was a cooperative bank, despite all the regulations, they had 65% of their loans given out to HDIL and DHFL, and basically one entity through a lot of hundreds of dummy companies. So this is when you have all your regulations, a lot of these things are already happening. So if a corporate owns a bank, they're saying that they could also kind of, despite regulations, do something similar. But what it calls for better supervision, better audits. It doesn't call for saying that corporate shouldn't own banks at all. And maybe as we had higher risk weights for real estate lending, you could have higher risk weight for lending to your own parent company or your sister company, if at all you would call it. So I think that is one way out where this could be allowed in some format.
Karan, your thoughts?
So I'm kind of conflicted on this, and I mentioned this, the last time I wrote on this as well. And of course, it has its pros and cons, but there are a lot of issues that Nirav rightly mentioned, and I think it's important to stress on them going forward. Of course, West does not have this. Advanced economies don't have their industrial sort of houses own banks, but we already allowed industrial houses to own NBFCs.
Yeah.
So fundamentally, I don't see a problem there, because NBFCs, if they so want, they can already lend to themselves. And the very fact that they're borrowing from banks means that in one way or the other, there is depositors' money. In fact, in this particular case, the problem is that it is banks' equity, which is owned by the public sector, that is at risk. In contrast, if suppose, a bank was supposed to be owned by the private enterprise, it is the private owner's equity that is at risk. And I think that's one thing that we need to keep in mind. The second thing, and I think this is a more theoretical perspective, but it's worth considering, is that for a bank with the incentive of maximizing profit, it would be better equipped to evaluate its proposals when it's coming from the parent company, because it will have access to all books, all information. So the problem of information asymmetry will be reduced. That said, in India, there is this tendency of frauds happening, and regulators are often behind the wheel. So we can, in one instance, perhaps, try to restrict that kind of lending activity. But we must recognize that even if we were to restrict that activity, it will still continue through some loophole or the other. So what is really needed is transparency and disclosures of what is the exposure of a particular bank if it is owned by a corporate entity to its parent entity. The third thing, and this is important because we find this mentioned every now and then, that when there are industrial houses owning banks, they may give them their parent companies preferential treatment in terms of the rate of interest. And I think that is an issue that needs to be looked into carefully in the Indian context. You see, we have been discussing about the problem of monetary transmission, about trying to fix rates to repo, etc. So if we really do go down that road, and if we do have those regulations in place, banks have, India, for instance, has this concept called priority sector lending, right? Yes. So priority sector lending, you can say that, okay, if an industrial house is owning banks, it has to lend a higher proportion to MSMEs, and the rate charge, the highest possible rate charge to an MSME has to be, say, 25 basis points lower than the prime lending rate that it will offer to its own entities. So those kind of interventions can also ensure that you do not have the kind of dominance of different business houses on both industrial and financial sector of India. More importantly, I think people often forget that till the time we have the public sector as a predominant player, such consolidation of market power is difficult. And it is difficult because of the regulations that are there, which kind of are skewed in favor of public sector banks in some ways or the other. whether it's in terms of the implicit trust of deposits and so on and so forth. So there is that implicit bias that does exist, and as long as that exists, I don't think that having private sector, corporate houses come into banking sector will destabilize the system as many fear. That's, I think, probably something that I think it's a hyperbole. It's not something that we should be really worried about. But we really do need to reflect on this. People who are saying that we should not have corporate houses as banks have not yet objected to the idea that corporate houses do own NBFCs.
Yes.
And it's essentially the same thing.
Yes.
It's essentially the same thing. The only difference is that A, there are light regulations. B, NBFCs do not have access to discount window. And what that really means is that if they don't have access to RBI's discount window, should there be an asset liability mismatch, they will go down. And if they go down, so does the taxpayers' money go, because at the end of the day, public sector banks are financed by the taxpayers. And unfortunately, people have not focused on this particular aspect. So if you have an objection to corporate sector getting into lending activities, then that should be also for NBFCs, and that should also go forward into peer-to-peer lending, which is being spearheaded by a lot of fintech startups. So are we going to say that, okay, no, we are not going to allow peer-to-peer lending to happen because we don't want someone to game the system. We don't want these platforms to be built. So you know what, let's allow them to have a size of, say, up to 50 crores. And after that, we'll not allow them to grow. So you create a perverse incentive structure in that sense. We are not going to be doing that.
Yeah.
So as I said in my previous response, that the banking sector in itself is about to change. And we really need to recognize these changes that are happening and consider a more appropriate and nuanced sort of view, or take a more nuanced view of this particular issue. And I can tell you that, if we were to do this, there will be opposition. Some people from different multilateral organizations may come and say that this is problematic, you shouldn't be doing this. And I think it's important at that point that we as commentators, government as and regulators, as regulators, go ahead and tell them that, look, this is something that was already happening in India. We are just trying to regulate it better. And I think that's exactly the way we should be proceeding. Should we, and I say this, with this condition attached, should we want to move in that direction?
Sure. I just had a follow-up question on that because it fits in nicely with your response. So you mentioned about the NBFCs, and the large ones are already owned by corporate houses. Should they be converted to banks first before letting some of the other corporates who are, say, not running NBFCs being allowed to start banks?
I think it would be a good idea to convert some of them into banks under obviously slightly stricter regulations and more stringent supervision for, say, a period of 3 to 4 years to see how that experiment works. And I think it's important that we try these things before we say yes or no, because we need to figure out a system that works best for us. You see, Indian economy is quite different from the more advanced economies which have achieved, a different level of financial sophistication. A good example is that US had a crisis in the banking sector because they were dealing with quite complex products. In India, we are having problems in the banking system because of plain vanilla lending. Yeah. So, the level of financial sophistication is different. The level of experience in the public sector is different. And allowing for greater private role in the sector will achieve two things: A, competition, and B, some of these institutions will eventually be strong enough and big enough to take over some of the weaker public sector banks. And I think that is also critical, to ensure that we save taxpayers' money, and we ensure that the depositor base of those banks are also particularly safe, secure, and they have the adequate capital adequacy norms are met at all times.
Sure. So Nirav, coming to you, the financial system is, there's a high level of interconnection, right? And you've spoken about the structure of banks and NBFCs, but there are debt mutual funds which lend to NBFCs. There are insurance companies which are in some way involved in, whether it's buying commercial paper or whatever, they invest money, right? Can you just explain, the structure of these other entities and how it kind of all fits in?
Sure. So debt mutual funds. So I had mentioned that, say there is a bank, I'd given an example, it has 100 rupees of assets and liabilities. Say a debt mutual fund, it has 100 people holding its units, say 1 rupee each. And then the debt mutual funds buy securities of, if not 100, maybe 20, or at least 20 different companies, 5 rupees each. It buys bonds, either of NBFCs or of corporate houses or of like banks bonds, and it passes through whatever returns it gets to the mutual fund holders. So here, in case of any defaults, it is, or any kind of even mark-to-market risk where the prices of securities can go up and down, it is passed on to the unit holder. Obviously, here in this debt mutual fund, you get a much higher return. So for a bank, on my bank savings account, I get 4%, and then the bank lends out at 8%. And the difference, it has to take out its cost of branches, employee salaries, etc., some regulatory costs. And after defaults, the rest is kept as profit, right? The mutual fund, if it is lending to the same people at 8%, its costs it deducts, but each unit holder gets maybe 7.5%, 7%. But I'm getting a higher return, but I'm getting a higher risk. It does not allow me to make payments. So that's another big function of banks, which some fintechs are taking over. I cannot transfer a part of it using a debit card to pay for a meal at a restaurant or something of that sort. So that is what a debt mutual fund does. So obviously you get higher returns, but there is higher risk. There is illiquidity as well. Some of these are closed-ended, that you cannot withdraw money for 3 years. Some of it for tax purposes. Now if you go to like an insurance company. So insurance company, what does it have? It has very long-term liabilities because it has people who are putting in, say, every year or every month, you keep on paying your insurance premium. If it is life insurance, you might have life expectancy of over 70 years, or like maybe after 65, 75 in India, but like in other countries in 80s. And when you either pass away or you redeem your policy, you get your money back. Typically, these are linked to some sort of an investment plan. So maybe at like 65, you say, I don't need life insurance anymore. I get back my money with some sort of minimum assured return. So an insurance company actually exactly opposite of a bank. It has very long-term liabilities. Even if it is like a car insurance or home insurance, etc., their liabilities are much longer dated, and their assets which they keep investing are at times shorter dated. Sometimes if a person starts buying life insurance since the day they are born, somebody's parents does that, you don't have like 75-year assets or 80-year assets, right? So typically, and that is where what India really needs on another part for better credit creation is a good corporate bond market, which is transparent. And so these debt securities between banks, NBFCs, your insurance companies, your debt mutual funds, there is an active market, and these debt securities, given larger trading volume, we do know of any stress in a corporate sector balance sheet. So for example, if you saw the IL&FS, the first pain was actually seen by debt mutual funds because they were having redemptions and they had to sell these securities. And if you have an active secondary market for these loans, instead of a bank giving a loan and that being held forever, you don't know till the maturity of the loan whether he's defaulting or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a better functioning financial market, and that is what we need. And by adding new players in, we could broaden the market. So we not only broaden the number of participants and increase the depth of the market. So that is what is another function of RBI, what they should be doing in parallel with adding more private sector banks.
Sure. So Nirav, another question to you. A lot of NBFCs today, so be it, Mahindra Finance or Shriram Transport Finance, they started off as asset financial arms of their parent organizations, right? So there should have been a conflict of interest there as well, right?
Yes.
And if it was there, is there an issue in them becoming banks? This is a follow up to the earlier question I'd asked to you.
Yeah. So, okay, if you look at it, even in, if you want a developed world example, General Motors and Ford. So, General Motors had GMAC and even
Yes.
GE had GE Finance.
Yeah.
And what they did, Jack Welch has famously said in his book, where he said that instead of somebody buying like GE's large equipment, which was a big balance sheet item, it could become an income statement item if you could finance him to buy it in installments. So the higher level of approval is not needed, and that is how they were a step ahead of competition. So exactly, like Shriram Transport financing trucks, or like Bajaj Finance earlier, which was financing their two-wheelers and also now consumer electronics, etc. What these have done is they have enabled their customers an easy access to finance. So you're lending someone to buy your own product, right? And yes, so if these firms, they have like a very good domain expertise in one particular customer segment. Even you have like the gold loan companies like Malappuram or Muthoot Finance, right? They have a very good domain expertise. And given that these have not gone bust, they've actually grown much bigger in size, they are run quite well, there is something which the banking sector can learn from them, right? So yes, there is a conflict of interest. But if they are to become a full-fledged bank, you need some sort of additional regulation that they cannot have such a large exposure just to one area. They could, they have to lend to like different parts. They could have like some priority sector lending goals in terms of percentage of lending as well as the maximum rate that they lend at. Also, if these NBFCs could merge with an existing bank with a large branch network. So say Punjab Maharashtra Cooperative Bank was taken over by some of these NBFCs. You have like one large liability base, a large branch base where you can raise deposits. And you have like one part which is very good in asset creation as well as selection of credit-worthy borrowers.
Yeah.
And only way people think banking is depositor driven. Actually, banking is borrower driven.
Yes.
Unless somebody is borrowing and borrowing and investing in a business which can return more at the end of it, the depositor is not going to get enough return on their capital.
Yeah.
And if you look at in developed economies where they've reached a very overly leveraged state, you are seeing that depositors don't get any return on their capital because there is not enough credit demand at that particular rate, or the economy is not growing, then nobody can borrow at a high rate and return money. So I think here, as you mentioned, yes, there could be conflict of interest, but say merging an NBFC, picking up some of their good skills, with say like a weaker PSU bank or a weaker private sector bank and taking their advantages, this could be a nice synergy where this could work quite well.
Sure. You saw Karan and I nodding our head vigorously in agreement there. Karan, any additional thoughts?
No, I honestly believe, that the way the debate has happened over the last couple of days is very unfortunate for various reasons. And I think I would like to just end on that note because it's very important that when people comment on these issues, they sort of, balance the positives and negatives of the same. And somehow I don't see that happening at the moment.
Sure.
For many years, we have seen people saying that, we need more banks, we need more capital. But while people argue for them, they don't provide a solution. And here we have a RBI working committee report, which is providing solutions. And rather than evaluating the solutions, we are, quick to say that let's junk the idea without a discussion on what are the potential disadvantages and advantages and how can we minimize the disadvantages. And I think this trend is something that is very disturbing. Overall, I think, of course, there are risks associated with anything that we do, but I believe that there is a case to experiment on this, and I think Nirav would agree with me on this. So we might as well just give it a shot and see where it leads us. And it could well be the case that after we do it, and if we do it successfully, as we have with BHIM, UPI, and so many other areas of our governance, if we are able to do it successfully, who knows? Probably even advanced economies may relook at some of their regulations and may want to adopt some of the sort of regulatory regimes that RBI is adopting. So let us for once recognize that we have the potential to do something different, and in the process, teach the world that, okay, this can be done in this manner while minimizing the risks. And I think we are very capable of doing that if we want to.
Sure. We'll come to the last segment on today's podcast. It's been a fascinating discussion. So Karan, I'll come to you on this last couple of questions. First one is, let's assume the worst case scenario. Like you mentioned at the start, it takes a long time for any of these regulations to fructify. Let's assume they don't go through. That's the worst case scenario. It gets rejected, or RBI decides they don't want to move forward with it. Where will capital for new banks, or expanding existing banks, because that's what we'll have to do if we are not going to get in new banks, where will that capital come from, or how do we go about expanding these existing banks then?
So, in the absence of us allowing for some of these corporate houses to come in, I think the only other way where we can find capital is foreign banks, and having foreign banks come in and set up their subsidiaries in India. To some extent, that is already underway. I think a lot of banks are looking at India. Unfortunately, that when they do look at India, they look at it as a market for specialized products. So we have a lot of foreign banks that do not provide full banking services in India. Even those that have their subsidiaries set in here, they focus on a very sort of restricted set of customers, a restricted set of lending, and so on and so forth. So if we really do want to expand the banking sector, we do need to find capital. If private sector is not going to be allowed, then we are left with two options. Either the government puts in more money, which is a strict no-no. We have already put in a lot of money and it hasn't really resulted in anything. So we'll have to tap into foreign players. It may not be a bad idea to get some of the asset management funds to also come in and take over some of our existing public sector banks that are small in terms of their sort of size at the moment. So those are certain areas that can be explored if we don't go ahead in this direction. I think the first best alternative would be to have both foreign players come in and allow greater space for NBFCs to become banks. That's the best case solution that we should be trying for and aspiring for.
Sure. So coming to the last question, and I'll come to both of you. I'll start with you, Nirav. You've spoken about some of the safeguards, etc., that need to be in place. What other things should the government watch out for, and what other safeguards should the RBI put in place if we are to go ahead with this corporatization and allowing NBFCs to start banks?
Yeah, sure. So the first safeguard is that you don't allow anybody to just say, okay, here I put in 5,000 crores or 50,000 crores of capital and I start a bank tomorrow, or like it's already that you are involved in the financial sector, either like you're running an NBFC or maybe like an insurance company or like an asset manager, and then you step in. So I think that is already step one. Two is you need a lot more stringent audit requirements, and you could keep like a bank which has like a corporate entity as a parent or as a sister entity, if both are equally big. Then you need some sort of a penal rate for lending to your own parent. So for every rupee that you lend to them, you actually need more equity capital reserve, or you need to pay something to the RBI in terms of a higher CRR, as well as on the deposit insurance. All banks pay some amount of money, for the ensuring the deposits. Corporate entities, if you want to rise, you will have to pay a higher deposit insurance. And what you want is the good management from the corporate sector to come in and grow these businesses. And they keep raising capital through subsequent share dilution. So like subsequent equity offerings. So what happens is that the parent company stake keeps getting smaller. And hence, once it is below, say, like a 26% threshold or a 10% threshold, then it is treated as just another bank. So what this also does is allows like good management of like these companies to seed and raise equity capital and do that. So that kind of makes the system a lot more safer. To be fair, we sometimes are saying that PSU banks are doing a very good job for depositors. But we had a case of, say, Punjab National Bank, where they could not reconcile between two systems, where, say, bank guarantees were given and the SWIFT and the bank's internal system were not reconciling. So that is also something which was an issue. And so we are already living in a suboptimal, imperfect situation. And given we have 70% of our banking sector still dominated by PSU banks, and they have a huge branch network, it is very difficult for it to become like a Japan, where you had like a top 4 or 5 banks having a large dominance, which were like cross-owned by a lot of corporates, and you will not get the kairetsus that easily. So you're already coming from a different starting point. And thing number 2 is Japan and Korea had decades of very fast growth, which was also enabled by the system. So there was some positive in it, right? Indonesia copied them, but implemented it badly. So we need to learn from both. Good implementation with prudent regulations can actually be a better step forward. And as Karan mentioned, that we lack anyone else to put in substantial amount of money to start a bank. So either it is foreign banks putting in subsidiaries, which a lot of them might feel India is a risky jurisdiction. A lot of the foreign banks' business in India is facilitate global multinational companies' business in India, as well as Indian companies' businesses overseas. So they're very good for cross-border lending, cross-border activities. But establishing a subsidiary, establishing a roots in the country, they're a little bit reluctant. And so even if it has been opened up, no one's coming in. So this is one route where we can expand our banking sector.
Absolutely. Current closing comment, same question to you.
Many people tell me that India has too many banks. India may have some 200-300 banks or so. US has 5,000.
Yes.
And we, of course, have a larger population, even though our per capita savings may be lower, but we do have a large population. I think one of the successes of the banking system in India overall has been to be able to serve the banking needs of the customers while having a very low ticket size. And I think that in itself shows that there are certain advantages that a model has in terms of deposits and payments and what we discussed before. So the problem is actually on the lending side, and the problem is primarily because of lack of competition. And if we really do want to incentivize it, we do need private capital to come in. And the next question is that how do we minimize the downside risks, which is what you are asking. Broadly, I think it has to be an experiment if we are to allow NBFCs. And I think we have to begin with NBFCs rather than allowing fresh corporate houses to come in. Because this is, of course, going to be a gamble. So if we're going to allow NBFCs, so we can identify 5 big NBFCs from the top 10, allow 5 of them to convert to banks. And as I said earlier, with stricter regulations and tighter regulatory oversight and supervision, and then see over a period of 5 years, what is the growth of those NBFCs that were allowed to convert to a bank as against the other 5 that weren't. Now, when I'm talking about tighter regulations, I do agree that slightly higher CRR, SLR are required to ensure that they have adequate liquidity. At the same time, I also believe that they should be subject to a higher PSL requirement. And there should be regulations curbing the amount of exposure to a single entity. On that, of course, many people, including Arvind Subramaniam, Vijay Kelkar, and Shankaracharya, who wrote today morning, if I'm not mistaken, they mentioned that India's regulatory system is already broken. So, why do you want to have this system going forward? And I think the similar point was also raised by Raghuram Rajan and Viral Acharya. I think the availability of big data now and the use of supercomputers and developing that sort of capacity within the RBI can prevent such activities to happen, because banking sector can be moved to a single sort of platform. We did it with Bheem, so why not do it with lending activities to restrict cross lending and so on and so forth. I think this is, if we really want to go ahead in that direction, we do need to invest a lot in these tech related solutions, and irrespective, even if we are not going to go in that direction, we do need to invest, so might as well just do it. So that's definitely a precursor, but I think broadly, by careful selection of who we allow in, and at the same time having these strong regulatory norms and supervision and oversight and so on and so forth, we should be able to mitigate a major part of that risk. And adding to that, at the same time, while we are reducing the risks associated with corporate houses coming and becoming banks, we are also able to mitigate the risks of NBFCs losing public money through the conventional sort of inefficient channel that we have at the moment. So these are the efficiency gains that we should really aim for. So it's a definitely, theoretically, practically, it's a plausible set to be explored, provided we do develop the capabilities needed to be able to execute it properly. So that is the only caveat that I would like to add. And I do believe that, our success in building some of these platforms does hint that we do have the capability to do it. The only question is whether we are willing to put in the necessary resources at the moment to develop them, or we are going to wait for some time to take a call on whether we are going to do this, or probably we are just going to junk it, like so many other recommendations have been junked in the past, including the one to link small savings rate with the repo. So as with most committee reports, the recommendations that are most contentious often don't go through. So we don't really know what is going to happen, but should they go for this, I think it is a pretty much a doable solution, worth considering, for sure.
Great points, Nirav and Karan. I particularly, agree with your point on big data, Karan. I know for a fact that some of the European regulation around forbearance and so on, this was 2014-15, where some sort of evergreening was happening. That was actually found out through the data that was submitted by banks to the regulators. And I think it's something that the RBI should look at and build that capability. So this has been a fantastic discussion, very insightful. So thank you both, Nirav and Karan, for joining in. Yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks. Happy to join.
Yeah, glad to be here. Yeah, thanks for having us here.
Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was brought to you by the team at Bharat Varta. If you liked this podcast, then don't forget to share, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite platforms. We're available on Anchor, Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, YouTube, and a host of other platforms. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you do wish to offer us any feedback on the content or anything else, do reach out to us on social media or get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.